a special guest whom we always catch on the sidelines of the IFA Congress here, former tax policy director Jeffrey Owens with us at the Madrid Congress. 3 days of riveting discussions, Jeffrey. You had the plenary, two important topics. We had dispute resolution yesterday, the concept of tax, a big debate on the EU ruling in the Apple tax case, which has divided the tax world in almost two camps. It's Europe's Vodafone moment, some called. Today, we had a very absorbing session on the OECD BEPS action plan on CBC. What are the key takeaways, Jeffrey, so far?
I think, in fact, I mean, the IFA once again has managed to choose topics that are topical, despite having selected them almost 4 years ago. Thank you. And clearly, the first panel on disputes, in some ways, that's the key issue, because we are going to see more disputes arising, in part because countries will continue to have different interpretations of some of the BEPS programs. But also, and that perhaps is a slight criticism of the panel, I find it was a little bit complacent. You can't judge what happens to the future by looking at the past data. We're going, as everybody keeps emphasizing over the last 3 days, we're going into a new era, an era of transparency, an era of revising the international tax rules that have been around for 50 or more years. Inevitably, there's going to be more disputes. So looking at the past and saying, well, it's not been too bad, that's not the guide to the future.
A big takeaway from the first panel, Jeffrey, on dispute resolution was on improving the MAP process, the efficiencies. And that seems to be one of the key pillars of the BEPS action plans.
Well, I actually think you have to move further back. Your first question when you're looking at the dispute issue is, why do countries have disputes? So you have to try to identify the causes why some countries have more disputes than others. It may be the way that the administrative courts work. It may be a reluctance on the part of officials to give rulings. It just may be the incentives that are built into the way the remuneration package of auditors is. So the first step is identify the causes of the disputes and then try to eliminate them.
Strike at the root.
Strike at the root. Then, in a sense, you move on and you say, well, what can you do by using techniques like the use of experts, the use of mediation, either outside of MAP or within MAP. And I think that many of the issues, in fact, can be resolved at that level. So in a sense, before you get into some heavy legal process, you're pulling an independent expert. You say, look, these are the facts in the transfer pricing case. What do you think of them? Or you have a mediator that comes in and tries to align people around a common position. So that's an important element. And then the third element, obviously, is to improve the existing MAP process.
And that, Jeffrey, you had the panel saying that there will be pressure to commit to a 24-month timeline to resolve MAP cases. Well, the panel talked about the tsunami of MAP cases. But also, Jeffrey, here, I was just wondering that with the pressure, with a public report, a review report that will come through in 2020 on how countries are doing vis-a-vis the MAP process, which countries are more efficient, which are probably a little less. Do you think countries will now take this seriously and will be under pressure to do more compromises than they would otherwise do?
Well, I think one thing is clear that, when the G20 says we're going to be reviewing this, countries will actually make an effort to make sure that they get a good scorecard at the end of the day. And you can see a number of countries are putting more resources in. Not all countries. Some of the big OECD countries, they are recognizing we can only have effective MAP if we have more resources. That needs now to trickle down to other countries outside of the OECD so that they actually build up their competent authorities. Because in some developing countries, it's one person you're talking about. That poor person has to deal with exchange of information, has to deal with all the international, the treaty stuff, and at the same time any disputes. So building up resources, I think, is a key. There's been some good progress made, but we need to continue.
But a mindset change, Jeffrey, mainly. The competent authorities have to change the mindset.
And I agree.
You had India close 100 cases with the US, and by bunching them together, identifying the issue and solving them.
Together, by changing personnel, by having a more constructive attitude. And that's a key thing, But it's not just at the level of the competent authorities. We need a mindset change at the level of the auditors. Because it's they that initiate the first sort of call on dispute cases. So they have to, in a sense, be saying, well, in this new environment, we have to be ensured that we are applying the rules correctly, the new BEPS rules, the new G20 endorsed rules.
Jeffrey, I have to get your take on the Apple ruling. It's roiled the tax world. They're calling it Europe's waterfall movement, and you saw what it did to India, its reputation when it comes to attracting foreign investments and retroactive tax laws. So we went through that for several years, and the Apple ruling, many people are saying, might lead to tax wars. The US threatening not to pull out of the BEPS project, but saying that it threatens the BEPS consensus. We had Mr. Bob Stack tell us in an interview a few minutes ago that, and he said at the Bloomberg reception yesterday, that it's an extraordinary rejection of the arm's length standard and a colossal blunder on part of the EU.
Well, one of the things that's always guided me in my professional career is never comment until you see the facts. Yeah? And frankly, I at least have not seen the facts on the Apple case. We've heard a lot. There's been a very short sort of redacted version put out.
Yeah. But in principle,
I think the interesting thing is there's one.
It's not that the facts are not known, Jeffrey.
Well,
it's not that Apple structures are not known. No. I think it's more about the legal principle.
Before you can talk about the legal principle, you need to have the facts. I mean, I can't tell you at this point what is the arm's length method that was used in these cases, yes? Because I haven't seen it. Yeah. I don't know whether that.
But is this a retroactive application of law? Is this retroactive?
You have to see it in the context of state aid, yes? And what they're following are their standard state aid practices. And it's a mistake to say somehow the state aid people have got into the tax. The state aid people have been looking at tax cases for 40 years, yeah? So they have a process, they have procedures that they have to follow. That's what they're doing, yeah? I also think that it's not correct to say somehow the EU is targeting the United States. It's targeting sectors where there have maybe been more opportunities.
So the companies just coincidentally happen to be American
companies.
Yeah.
And you can see that because if you actually look at some of the other state aid tax cases, there are European countries. And in fact, they've just opened against a large French multinational, yeah?
But there are repercussions, Jeffrey.
I think when you move to the political level, that there may be repercussions. I mean, this is not the time to have a split between the European Union and the United States. Yes? We need to maintain a coordinated position, particularly in the context of the Transatlantic Trade Pact. Yeah? I mean, that is already in a very difficult situation.
The TPP.
The TPP. And I would be a bit concerned if, because of the Apple ruling, we were not able to conclude this by the end of the year. Yeah, there are a lot of issues on that on the table there. A lot of past segments of the public. Some EU countries have publicly come out and said they don't think this is a good thing. I think they're making a mistake. I mean, what you have to hold on to on the TPP is that if this were implemented, it could actually increase the growth of GDP by anything between 1 to 1.2%. That's a trebling of the growth, yeah? That's what we need to hold on. And it would be a shame if because of this Apple dispute that somehow...
But what's your crystal ball gazing tell you? Where is this Apple dispute headed? Are we headed to the courts and an acrimonious litigation? Or is it possible that some suave backdoor negotiations could save the situation?
Again, you have to understand the way that the EU works and the state rule, state aid. You have to understand the role of the European Court of Justices. Clearly, the appeals have been launched. You now need to go to the next stage. Yes? One of the things that's regrettable, that's going to take time. Yeah? This case could go on for 3, 4, 5 years, yeah? And that's going to generate a lot of uncertainty. Yeah? And that I do regret. Yeah? But again, I haven't seen all the facts. So,
sure.
Yeah.
So that's a caveat, Jeffrey. Yes. On the BEPS project, we've been talking about it since Copenhagen.
We've been talking about
this
it
is the
for a
4th
long
Congress.
Time.
We are doing the interview.
Yep.
We've come a long way. What looked almost implausible 3 years ago now is on the verge of completion. You have 100 countries committing to it. The Multilateral Instrument, as we heard in this Congress from Mr. Prost, that the core text is almost ready. You are happy with the progress as a person who's headed this organization for over a decade?
I'm very happy with that progress. I think there was a time when we needed BEPS. It came at the right time. Our existing rules were not fit for purpose. It's been a very inclusive process, bringing in the BRICS, bringing in the other G20 countries, bringing in some developing countries. So that process, I think, has led to some good results. I wouldn't agree that it's over. No? There's a long way to go to get consistent implementation, and particularly for those countries that still don't have the capacity to implement some of the rules.
I mean, the first phase is over with the multilateral instrument almost on the verge of signing. That's a big thing.
The multilateral instrument to me is something that goes beyond BEPS. I mean, when I was at the OECD, I tried to get this type of approach to the Working Party One people, so that not just for BEPS really measures, but for treaty measures generally. Yeah, because we can't continue the current process. Where the OECD identifies a treaty issue. 2 years. It analyzes the issue, 5 years. It comes out with recommendations and amendments to the OECD Model Convention, yep, and then 15 years to get into the treaty network. In today's world, that is no longer acceptable. So what I would like to see is, one, when the multilateral instrument is published, that we get it very quickly signed, ratified, and actually enforced. Well, that means probably 2 years. And then we begin a debate on the experience of using that instrument. Maybe we could think, perhaps for other treaty provisions that are not linked to BEPS. And that is very interesting for developing countries. Huh? It's very interesting for the UN model. Because one of the things that developing countries face is they may have one person or half a person that's negotiating treaties. Huh? So if you have 20 or 30 treaties and you have to update them, it's a lifetime. Whereas if you've got the multilateral instrument, 2 years and they're updated. So for developing countries, the multilateral instrument is extremely attractive.
And we also heard something very interesting, Jeffrey, today, that the inclusive framework network that's been formed, you have almost 85 countries that have signed on to it, and more are going to sign on. It might work beyond BEPS. So we are essentially looking at a continued coordinated global tax policy landscape, Jeffrey.
Well, you could see there was some difference of views on the panel there, yeah?
Especially Mr. Stack.
Mr. Staggs, yeah? I think we need to see that it does work effectively, that there is a real voice, there's a real say, in fact, for developing countries, that they have the capacity to engage in that debate, yeah? Because you can only have influence if you have knowledge. Yeah? So that's very important, build up their capacity, and then in 3-5 years' time, maybe we can step back and say, well, if this has worked in this area, maybe it can work in others. That will then raise the question of where does that leave the United Nations Tax Committee?
Which is what we discussed yesterday, Jeffrey. And was there a conclusion?
The conclusion that was there, that the UN...
Quite honestly, Jeffrey, is it going to become less and less relevant? If you have 100 countries signing up to the Inclusive Framework Network, what will the UN do?
I think the UN has a role of actually providing a forum where developing countries themselves can dictate the agenda, can dictate the standards, can dictate the time paces and engagement. Yeah? But for that to happen, for the UN committee to play a real role, it needs more resources. As I said yesterday,
not just two.
They have 2 people. The OECD has 145. That's a mismatch. Yes. So I think it's time for the BRICS to put their money where their mouths are. The BRICS, in fact, were very vocal in Addis in saying we want to make this. Well, they talked about the status of the group. Forget that for the moment. Let's just make the group more effective. Let's give the group more resources. Yes? And if each BRIC put in $1 million, 5 million together, yeah, that would change dramatically the role and the effectiveness of the UN Tax Committee. They would have staff. They could have specialized staffs on treaties, on transfer pricing, on VAT, on extractives, on dispute settlement. And I think that's in the OECD's interest, because particularly as the Inclusive Forum moves forward, it's a good thing, in fact, that the UN can feed into that debate by helping their countries, developing countries.
$4 or $5 million, Jeffrey, is nothing, right? You have India alone, which has a federal tax revenue of $30 billion.
And that's what I'm saying. Look, Christmas is coming. Each BRIC puts in 1 million. That's not
capacity building at UN, absolutely.
Yep.
Jeffrey, crystal ball gazing for the next 12 months, BEPS project, what are the 3 things you are looking at? You have the multilateral instrument, you have the companies which will now be implementing CBC, and you'll have countries which will be legislating the BEPS action plan. If you could take us through each one of them.
I think the 3 things that I would be looking at is the whole Action 5 on harmful tax competition, harmful preferential regimes. I'm pleased that they've gone back to the 98 report, because that's the Bible in this area. Everything that you want to know is there, and that now, in principle, the countries that have agreed, the 80-odd countries that have agreed to come into the inclusive framework, have signed on to that. So they will have to review their preference sheet. I know from my experience how difficult that is. Yes. So I think I'll be watching very carefully what's the outcome. I think it's a good thing.
So one is harmful tax avoidance.
Harmful tax. The other one is the country by country.
That's the big gorilla in the room.
Well, you see, I actually think this is something that, when we look back in 5 years' time, we'll ask, why did we see it as the gorilla? It's just about transparency, yeah? And putting that information out to tax authorities. It'll help them understand the business models of large multinationals. And tax authorities that have that understanding are less likely to make mistakes, are less likely